November 20th, 1759. Admiral Edward Hawke stood on the quarterdeck of HMS Royal George, watching the French fleet flee into Quiberon Bay through a rising gale. 21 French ships of the line were escaping into a treacherous maze of shoals, rocks, and islands where no sane admiral would pursue in a storm. Behind those ships lay 50,000 French troops waiting to invade Britain, the largest invasion force assembled since the Spanish Armada. Hawke's choice was impossible. Follow the French into deadly waters during a gale with darkness approaching, risking his entire fleet on rocks he couldn't see, or let them escape and face a French invasion that could end the war and destroy Britain's emerging empire. He gave the order that would change history. All sail after them. Within 3 hours, 6 French ships would be on the bottom. Britain's invasion threat would be permanently ended, and the Royal Navy's dominance would be secured for the next century. Yet today, ask anyone to name Britain's greatest admiral, and they'll say Nelson. Hawke, the man who saved Britain through aggressive brilliance that made Nelson's tactics look cautious, is forgotten. This is the story of the battle that prevented an invasion, won an empire, and vanished from popular memory. If you're fascinated by decisive naval battles, forgotten heroes, and moments when one decision changed history, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened in the storm-lashed waters of Quiberon Bay on November 20th, 1759, was one of the most audacious military actions in British history, and almost nobody remembers it. The 7 Years' War had been grinding across the globe since 1756, consuming Europe, North America, the Caribbean, India, and Africa in what truly was the First World War. By 1759, Britain faced simultaneous crises on multiple continents whilst bankrolling continental allies and maintaining naval supremacy against France and Spain. The year would later be celebrated as the Annus Mirabilis, the Year of Miracles. But in the autumn of 1759, it looked more like Britain's darkest hour. French armies threatened Hanover in Germany. French forces battled British in North America and India, and most terrifyingly, 50,000 French troops assembled along the Channel coast, preparing to invade England itself. The French invasion plan was breathtaking in scope and ambition. The Duc de Choiseul, France's chief minister, had coordinated the construction of hundreds of flat-bottomed invasion barges at ports from Dunkirk to Brittany. These vessels would carry infantry, cavalry, artillery, and supplies across the Channel once the French Navy secured even temporary control of the narrow seas. The target wasn't a single landing, but multiple simultaneous invasions along the English and Scottish coasts, overwhelming Britain's modest militia forces before they could concentrate. If successful, French troops would march on London, force a peace settlement, and reverse every British colonial gain of the war. Canada would be returned, India abandoned, and Britain reduced to second-rate status. Everything depended on the French fleet. That fleet was supposed to come from 2 directions. Admiral de la Clue commanded 12 ships of the line in Toulon, tasked with breaking out of the Mediterranean, sailing around Gibraltar, and joining the main Brest fleet for the invasion. In August 1759, de la Clue made his attempt. British Admiral Edward Boscawen, commanding the Mediterranean squadron, pursued him past Gibraltar and caught him off Lagos on the Portuguese coast. The Battle of Lagos on August 18, 19 was brutal and decisive. 5 French ships were destroyed or captured. De la Clue's fleet was eliminated as a fighting force. The Mediterranean contingent would never join the invasion. Now everything depended entirely on the Brest fleet under Admiral Hubert de Brienne, Comte de Conflans. Conflans was an experienced commander with 21 ships of the line, powerful warships carrying between 64 and 80 guns across 2 or 3 decks. These weren't obsolete relics, but modern, well-built vessels manned by professional crews. Conflans' mission was straightforward: break out of Brest, destroy the British blockading squadron, escort the invasion fleet across the Channel, and protect the landings long enough for French troops to establish beachheads. The British response to this threat rested on one man: Edward Hawke. Hawke, at 54, was a career naval officer who'd spent his entire adult life at sea. Unlike many admirals who'd obtained rank through political connections or aristocratic birth, Hawke had earned his position through competence and aggression. His reputation had been forged in 1747 at the First Battle of Finistère, where he'd pursued a French convoy with such determination that he'd captured 6 French warships and numerous merchantmen. That battle had established what came to be known as the Hawke method: close pursuit, immediate attack, acceptance of risk for decisive victory, and trust in subordinate commanders to show initiative. These weren't revolutionary concepts individually, but Hawke combined them into a coherent, aggressive doctrine that violated the cautious orthodoxy dominating naval warfare. Traditional naval strategy emphasized preserving the fleet. Admirals were expected to maintain formation, avoid unnecessary risks, and recognize that ships represented enormous investments that shouldn't be hazarded recklessly. This thinking had merit. Losing the fleet meant losing the war, but it produced indecisive battles where fleets maneuvered cautiously, exchanged broadsides at long range, and separated without decisive result. The ghost of Admiral John Byng haunted every British naval officer. Byng had been court-martialed and executed in 1757 for failing to relieve Minorca aggressively enough. Voltaire famously quipped that Britain executed admirals pour encourager les autres, to encourage the others. The lesson was clear: lose badly and die, but also don't risk losing by being too aggressive. Hawke rejected this paralyzing doctrine. His blockade of Brest throughout 1759 was revolutionary in its intensity. Previous British admirals had maintained open blockade, stationing the fleet at safe distance, perhaps at Torbay or Plymouth, where it could respond if the French sailed but wasn't constantly exposed to channel weather. Hawke implemented close blockade, keeping his ships off Brest harbour constantly, regardless of weather. This meant his fleet endured autumn gales, supply difficulties, and ship wear that conventional wisdom said was unacceptable. But it also meant Conflans couldn't escape without immediate British response. For months, Hawke's presence trapped Conflans in port whilst the invasion army waited and the campaign season slipped away. The strategic stakes were absolute. If Conflans destroyed Hawke's fleet, nothing stood between 50,000 French troops and the English coast. Britain's army was small, committed to continental operations and colonial campaigns. The militia was brave, but untrained and poorly equipped. Against French regulars, they'd be slaughtered. If the invasion succeeded, Britain would lose the war on terms that would be devastating. French peace would mean returning conquered territories, paying massive reparations, and accepting permanent strategic inferiority. The British Empire that would dominate the 19th century would never exist. Everything hinged on Hawke stopping Conflans. Early November brought the autumn gales that Channel sailors dreaded. On November 9th, a massive storm built from the Atlantic, driving waves over the decks of Hawke's ships and threatening to smash them onto the rocky Brittany coast. By November 12th, the weather was so violent that Hawke had no choice but to run before the storm toward Plymouth and Torbay to avoid losing ships to the elements. His fleet was scattered, battered, needing repairs. Ships had sprung leaks, lost rigging, and exhausted their crews. Any sensible admiral would wait for the weather to improve, repair the damage properly, and return to station when conditions permitted. Conflans knew this. French intelligence reported that British ships had been driven off station and were sheltering in English ports. This was his opportunity. On November 14, 1759, Conflans sailed from Brest with 21 ships of the line. The weather had temporarily calmed, giving him the window he needed. His objective wasn't the main British fleet. He assumed they were still in port, but a smaller British squadron under Commodore Robert Duff, stationed in Quiberon Bay further south. Duff commanded only 5 ships of the line watching French preparations in the bay's ports. If Conflans could destroy Duff's squadron quickly, he'd secure Quiberon Bay as a staging area, unite with the invasion forces there, and potentially cross the channel before Hawke could intervene. It was a reasonable plan based on reasonable assumptions about British behaviour. But Hawke wasn't a reasonable admiral. On November 14th, the same day Conflans escaped, Hawke had already returned to sea. Against conventional wisdom, against the advice of officers who wanted more time for repairs, against every normal standard of naval practice, Hawke had pushed his fleet back toward Brest to resume the blockade. He believed that maintaining pressure on the enemy mattered more than perfect readiness. When fishing boats and merchant vessels brought news that Conflans had escaped, Hawke immediately calculated where the French admiral would go. Not toward the Channel directly, too risky without first eliminating British forces in the area. Quiberon Bay, Duff's squadron. That's where Conflans would strike first. Hawke turned south and drove his fleet at maximum speed toward Quiberon Bay. The weather was deteriorating again. By November 19th, the wind was building toward gale force. By the morning of November 20th, heavy seas were running and the sky promised worse to come. Hawke knew he was racing against time, weather, and geography. If he arrived too late, Duff would be destroyed, and Conflans would have secured his staging area. If he arrived too early without sufficient force concentrated, Conflans might defeat him piecemeal. The timing had to be perfect, and Hawke was navigating toward one of the most dangerous coastlines in Europe in deteriorating weather. Commodore Duff's situation on the morning of November 20th was desperate. His lookouts had spotted Conflans' fleet approaching from the north, 21 ships of the line against his 5. There was no possibility of fighting. His only option was to flee, draw Conflans away from the bay, and hope that Hawke was somewhere nearby. Duff turned his squadron northwest and ran before the wind with Conflans in pursuit. It was a stern chase with the French slowly gaining on the slower British ships. Duff's squadron was sailing for their lives, knowing that if Conflans caught them before Hawke arrived, they'd be destroyed. Around noon on November 20th, Hawke's fleet appeared on the northwestern horizon. His lookouts spotted the chase, Duff fleeing, Conflans pursuing. Conflans' lookouts spotted Hawke simultaneously. The French admiral now faced his own impossible choice. He could turn and fight Hawke in the open sea in increasingly heavy weather, which might give the British the decisive battle they wanted. Or he could continue into Quiberon Bay, where his ships could anchor in the lee of the islands, protected from both the storm and British attack. The geography and weather would work in his favour. British ships would never dare follow into the shoal-filled bay in a gale with darkness approaching in mere hours. Quiberon Bay was a natural harbour on the southern coast of Brittany, a broad indentation in the French coastline that promised shelter from Atlantic gales but delivered deadly hazards to unfamiliar navigators. The bay stretched several miles across, dotted with islands, surrounded by rocks that broke the surface at low tide and lurked invisibly beneath at high tide. The cardinals, jagged rock formations, guarded the approaches like stone sentinels. Lefort Shoal extended treacherously near the entrance. Tidal currents raced through channels between islands with enough force to drive ships onto rocks even in calm weather. French pilots spent careers learning these waters, and even they avoided entering during storms. For British ships with no local knowledge, entering Quiberon Bay in a gale would be navigational suicide. Conflans knew this. Every principle of naval warfare said an admiral should never risk his fleet in restricted waters without overwhelming necessity. Cornering yourself in a bay against a lee shore in a storm was exactly what naval doctrine taught you never to do. But Conflans calculated that the British wouldn't follow. Orthodox admirals, which described virtually everyone except possibly Hawke, would anchor outside the bay, wait for the storm to pass, and engage the next day in open water with proper visibility and room to maneuver. By then, Conflans could have anchored his fleet securely, perhaps even slipped some ships away during the night, or at minimum would fight the next morning in waters he understood while the British navigated blindly. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, Conflans began leading his fleet into Quiberon Bay. The wind was blowing at gale force from the west, driving heavy swells before it. Rain squalls reduced visibility periodically. The leading French ships negotiated the entrance carefully, pilots guiding them past the known hazards toward anchorages in the lee of the islands where they'd be protected from both weather and British guns. Conflans himself in the 80-gun flagship Soleil Royal led the way, followed by his fleet in rough order. The maneuver was dangerous even for the French, but less dangerous than facing Hawke in open water in these conditions. On Royal George's quarterdeck, Hawke watched the French enter the bay. His officers understood what was happening and what it meant. Captain Campbell, the ship's commander, almost certainly advised caution. Other officers would have pointed out the obvious. Sunset was approaching at 4:30, giving them perhaps 2 hours of diminishing daylight. The weather was worsening by the minute. They had no charts of the bay's interior. French waters were uncharted by British vessels. Rocks and shoals that French pilots knew intimately were invisible hazards to British navigators. Fighting a fleet action while simultaneously avoiding running aground was difficult enough in daylight and calm weather. Attempting it in a gale with darkness approaching was madness. Hawke had minutes to decide. If he anchored outside the bay and waited for morning, Conflans would have escaped the immediate threat. The French might slip away during the night in the storm. They might anchor so securely that digging them out would require a prolonged siege. They might even defeat British ships piecemeal if Hawke's fleet entered the bay in daylight the next day without the pressure of immediate pursuit. Most damning, waiting meant letting Conflans control the timing and potentially preserve his fleet for another attempt at invasion. Everything Hawke had worked for throughout the year, the grinding blockade, the acceptance of storm damage, the immediate return to sea despite his fleet's battered condition, would be wasted if Conflans escaped now. The decision Hawke made violated every principle of careful naval warfare. At approximately 2:30 on November 20th, 1759, he turned to his flag captain and gave the order that would define his career. All sail after them. The signal was hoisted immediately. General chase. It meant every British ship was to pursue the French independently at maximum speed, breaking the traditional line of battle formation. Captains were to use their own judgment navigating the bay, engaging targets of opportunity, and avoiding hazards. Hawke was trusting 23 individual ship commanders to fight an improvised battle in unknown waters during a storm while darkness approached. It was revolutionary, risky, and exactly what the situation demanded. The British fleet followed Hawke into Quiberon Bay. HMS Resolution led the chase, her 74 guns run out ready for action as she navigated past Le Fort Shoal into the bay proper. Behind her came the entire British fleet in no particular order, ships entering as they arrived at the bay entrance, racing to catch the French before they could anchor safely. The wind drove them forward at terrifying speed. Heavy seas made steering difficult, with quarterdecks awash in spray and lower gun decks barely above the waterline. Ships heeled dramatically in the gusts, their masts bending, rigging screaming in the wind. Conflans, looking back from Soleil Royal, must have experienced absolute shock. No British admiral had ever done this. The professional calculation said they wouldn't dare. But there was Hawke's entire fleet pouring into the bay after him in the middle of a gale with darkness less than 2 hours away. Conflans' neat plan of anchoring safely and forcing the British to wait evaporated. Now he had to fight immediately in conditions where his advantages of local knowledge were partially negated by the chaos of the weather and the speed of the British attack. His fleet wasn't formed for battle. Ships were scattered at various stages of entering the bay, some still outside, some partially in, some already seeking anchorage. The organized defense he might have mounted in open water was impossible in these circumstances. The first engagements began around 3 o'clock as the fastest British ships caught the rearmost French vessels. HMS Warspite, a 74-gun ship of the line, engaged the French 80-gun Formidable in a brief, brutal exchange at close range. The range was perhaps 50 yards, close enough to see individual men on the enemy deck, close enough that musket fire from Marines in the rigging could kill officers. Both ships fired their broadsides almost simultaneously. The sound was overwhelming even in the gale, the smoke instantly blown downwind by the fierce westerly. Damage was immediate and severe to both vessels, but neither sank. Formidable pulled away, continuing into the bay, while Warspite pursued other targets. HMS Revenge engaged the French 74-gun Thésée with consequences that demonstrated just how dangerous these conditions were for everyone involved. Thésée was a powerful ship, well commanded and properly crewed. But in the gale-force winds and heavy seas, her lower gun deck, normally the source of her heaviest firepower, had become her fatal vulnerability. To fire her lower guns, the gun ports had to be open. In these seas, waves were breaking over the lower deck regularly. When Revenge's broadside struck Thésée, damage from the impacts wasn't what destroyed her. Water flooding through the open lower gun ports was. Within minutes, Thésée was taking on water faster than her pumps could manage. She heeled over as water accumulated on the lower decks, rolled completely, and sank bow first. Of her 650 crew, only 22 were pulled from the water alive. More than 600 men drowned in moments, trapped below decks or swept away in the freezing Atlantic water. The lesson was immediate and terrifying. Lower gun decks were unusable in these conditions. Opening the gun ports invited disaster. This meant every ship, British and French, was fighting with reduced firepower, essentially evening the odds despite French advantages in size on some ships. Hawke had known this was likely when he ordered the pursuit. The gale that made entering the bay dangerous also made fighting in it slightly less suicidal by limiting how many guns could be fired safely. Around 3:30, Hawke in Royal George caught up with Conflans in Soleil Royal. This was the moment both admirals had manoeuvred toward, the flagship duel that would determine fleet morale and possibly the battle's outcome. Royal George mounted 100 guns across 3 decks, though only her upper decks could fight in these seas. Soleil Royal carried 80 guns, but was equally limited. The 2 flagships closed rapidly, Royal George bearing down under full sail despite the conditions. Conflans attempted to maneuver away, using his knowledge of local waters to navigate closer to shoals than he thought Hawke would dare. But Hawke followed relentlessly. Royal George's bow chased Soleil Royal's stern, seeking the advantageous position where broadside fire could rake the length of the French flagship without receiving return fire. The range closed to 100 yards, 75, 50. Both ships fired as guns bore. The sound was continuous thunder even in the gale. Smoke poured from gun ports, immediately shredded by the wind. Splinters flew where iron balls struck oak. Men died on both quarterdecks as musket fire from Marines in the rigging picked off officers and helmsmen. But neither flagship achieved decisive advantage. The weather, the maneuvering, and the approaching darkness all prevented the prolonged close action needed to force a surrender. Throughout the bay, individual ship actions created a confused melee that resembled no naval battle in living memory. There were no neat parallel lines of ships exchanging disciplined broadsides. Instead, British ships pursued French vessels in a violent chase through shoal-filled waters in a storm. French ships attempted to escape, to form defensive groups, or to anchor in the lee of islands. Some fought, some fled. British ships followed individually or in small groups, each captain making independent decisions about which enemy to engage and how to navigate the deadly geography. HMS Magnanime, under Captain Lord Howe, who would himself become famous in later wars, engaged the French 74-gun Eros in a fierce exchange. Howe handled his ship brilliantly, maneuvering close, firing devastating broadsides, and forcing Eros to strike her colours in surrender. In the midst of a gale in an enemy bay, Howe had captured a French ship of the line. It was exactly the kind of aggressive, competent action Hawke's general chase order was designed to enable. Give capable captains freedom to act, and they'd achieve what rigid formation orders never could. The French 70-gun Superbe, attempting to maneuver through the chaos toward the relative safety of the inner anchorages, found herself caught between HMS Royal George and HMS Hero simultaneously. Both British ships fired at close range, their broadsides smashing into Superbe's hull at nearly point-blank distance. The damage was catastrophic. Masts came crashing down, rigging collapsed in tangled heaps, and the hull timbers shattered under the impact of iron balls weighing between 12 and 32 pounds, travelling at high velocity. But it wasn't the gunfire alone that destroyed Superbe. Dismasted and unmanageable, she drifted helplessly in the gale-force winds toward Lefort Shoal, the very hazard that made entering the bay so dangerous. Her crew could do nothing. Without masts and sails, a ship of the line was simply a wooden hull at the mercy of wind and current. Lefort's rocks tore into Superb's bottom as she ground onto the shoal. The impact rolled her over, water pouring through the shattered hull and open gun ports. Within minutes, she capsized completely and sank, taking approximately 650 of her crew with her. Perhaps 20 men survived, clinging to wreckage until rescued. It was the second French ship to sink in less than an hour, and like Thésée before her, she'd been destroyed as much by the storm and geography as by British gunfire. HMS Resolution, one of the first British ships to enter the bay in aggressive pursuit, paid the price for that aggression. While chasing French ships deeper into the bay, her navigation went fatally wrong. Whether from miscalculation, unexpected current, or simple bad fortune in the poor visibility, Resolution struck a shoal hard enough to ground firmly. She heeled over, stuck fast, unable to move despite desperate efforts by her crew. In the middle of a battle in enemy waters, she was helpless. French ships could have destroyed her at leisure, a stationary target unable to maneuver or escape. But the French were too busy fleeing or fighting other British ships to exploit the opportunity. Resolution would remain grounded throughout the night, her crew expecting either capture or destruction at any moment. By 4 o'clock, the light was failing rapidly. Winter sunset in Brittany comes early in November, and the storm clouds made the gathering darkness even worse. Visibility that had been difficult in the gale-driven rain squalls became nearly impossible as twilight descended. Ships were now fighting in semi-darkness, struggling to identify friend from foe at any distance beyond a few hundred yards. Signal lanterns could barely be seen through the spray and rain. The battle that had been chaotic in daylight became absolutely confused in the gathering gloom. Hawke made the decision to anchor. There was no point continuing the battle in darkness when ships couldn't identify targets and risked colliding with each other or running onto unseen rocks. The signal went out. Anchor when safe position found. British ships began seeking anchorage throughout the bay, using depth soundings and what little they could see to find relatively protected positions away from the shoals. It was extraordinarily dangerous work. Anchoring in darkness in unknown waters meant ships were guessing where rocks might be, where currents would push them, and whether their anchors would hold on the bottom. But the alternative, continuing to sail blind through the bay, was even more dangerous. The French fleet was scattered across Quiberon Bay in complete disarray. Some ships had managed to anchor near the islands and mainland shore. Some were still trying to reach anchorage. Some had fled through the eastern passages out of the bay toward Rochefort. Conflans in Soleil Royal anchored near the Croisic Peninsula with 7 or 8 other ships, hoping to ride out the night and assess the disaster in the morning. The unified fleet that had sailed from Brest that morning no longer existed as a fighting force. Individual ships survived, some relatively undamaged, but the coordination and command structure had been shattered. As darkness completed its fall around 5 o'clock, the storm intensified rather than moderating. The gale that had been fierce during the afternoon battle increased to what sailors would call a full tempest. Waves broke over the decks of anchored ships. Anchor cables strained against the force of wind and current. Crews aboard every vessel, British and French, worked desperately to ensure their anchors held and their ships didn't drag onto the rocks that surrounded them invisibly in the darkness. HMS Essex, a 64-gun ship that had fought through the afternoon battle without major damage, found herself in a deadly situation as the night storm built. Her anchors held initially, but the force of the gale was tremendous. Around midnight, one anchor cable parted under the strain. The ship was now held by a single anchor in conditions that would challenge two. Her crew worked frantically in the darkness and storm to set additional anchors, but the wind and current were pushing her steadily toward shore. The remaining anchor cable parted around 2 in the morning. Essex began drifting immediately, her crew helpless to prevent her being driven toward the rocks of an island shore. The impact when Essex struck was devastating. The rocky shore tore into her hull below the waterline. Waves broke over her decks as she heeled over. In the darkness and storm, organized evacuation was impossible. Some men managed to reach the shore alive, stumbling through surf and over rocks. Most of the crew, perhaps 400 men, drowned as Essex broke apart under the pounding of the waves. It was the only major British loss of the battle, but it was catastrophic for the men aboard. They'd survived the afternoon's combat, only to die in the night's storm, wrecked on French shores they'd invaded so boldly hours earlier. The French suffered worse through that terrible night. Juste, a 70-gun ship attempting to flee the bay through the eastern passages in darkness, ran directly onto rocks. The crew had been trying to escape to Rochefort, navigating by guess and memory in the storm. The rocks tore her bottom out. She sank rapidly, taking approximately 700 of her crew with her. Only a handful of survivors reached shore. It was another reminder that the weather and geography were killing as efficiently as British gunfire. Conflans, anchored near Croisic with the remnants of his fleet, spent the night in despair. His flagship Soleil Royal had taken damage in the afternoon fighting. His fleet was scattered and broken. He could hear, distantly over the wind, the sounds of ships in distress, wood splintering on rocks, the faint calls of drowning men. He knew some of his ships had sunk. He didn't yet know how many or which ones. As dawn approached, he had to decide whether to attempt to continue fighting or to save what remained of his fleet. Dawn on November 21st revealed the extent of the disaster. British ships anchored throughout the bay could see French wrecks on the rocks and shoals. Thésée and Superbe were gone, sunk during the battle. Juste had wrecked during the night. HMS Essex lay broken on an island shore, a painful British loss, but insignificant compared to French casualties. Conflans' Soleil Royal was visible anchored near Croisic, but isolated from most of the French fleet. Several French ships had successfully fled to Rochefort during the night or early morning. Others were scattered around the bay, some in defendable positions, some not. The battle was over, but Hawke's position was still dangerous. His fleet was anchored in enemy waters, surrounded by shoals, with damaged ships and exhausted crews. French shore batteries could potentially fire on British ships from the mainland. Reinforcements might arrive from other French ports. The immediate tactical victory was clear, but consolidating that victory required getting his fleet and prizes safely out of the bay and back to British waters. Conflans made his final decision regarding Soleil Royal that morning. His flagship was too damaged to risk sailing, too isolated to defend, and too valuable as a symbol to let the British capture. On November 22nd, French sailors stripped the ship of anything useful, then set her on fire. Soleil Royal burned to the waterline and sank, destroyed by her own crew to prevent capture. It was an ignominious end for a magnificent flagship, a symbol of French naval power reduced to charred wreckage by French hands, because keeping her from British possession was preferable to watching her be towed away as a prize. The French ship Héros, captured by Lord Howe during the battle, provided an embarrassing coda to British triumph. She'd been taken as a prize with a British crew put aboard to sail her back to England. But during the night's confusion and storm, her French crew managed to overpower the small British prize crew, regain control of their ship, and sail her to Rochefort. It was humiliating for the British, losing a captured prize in the aftermath of total victory, but strategically meaningless. Héros reached Rochefort too damaged to be combat effective for months. Another French vessel, Inflexible, attempted to flee toward Rochefort on November 22nd, but ran onto rocks in the attempt and wrecked completely. She joined the growing list of French ships destroyed not in combat, but by the deadly combination of storm and treacherous waters that made Quiberon Bay so lethal. By November 23rd, Hawke had consolidated his victory and begun withdrawing from the bay. The strategic assessment was overwhelming in British favour. Of Conflans' 21 ships that had entered the bay, 6 or 7 had been destroyed outright. Thésée and Superbe sunk in battle, Juste wrecked fleeing during the night, Soleil Royal burned by the French themselves, Inflexible wrecked attempting to escape. French casualties approached 2,500 killed, most of them drowned when ships sank or wrecked. British losses were HMS Essex, with approximately 400 casualties, plus normal battle casualties of perhaps 200 more killed and wounded across the fleet. The strategic consequences of Quiberon Bay manifested immediately and devastatingly for French plans. The 50,000 troops assembled along the Channel coast for invasion remained there uselessly as autumn turned to winter. Without the fleet to escort them, to protect their vulnerable flat-bottomed transports, and to contest British naval forces, invasion was impossible. By December, the troop concentrations began to disperse. Units were sent to other theatres, Germany, the Caribbean, garrison duties. The invasion barges were laid up, eventually rotting in their harbours or being broken up for timber. The grand strategy to end the war through a decisive blow against Britain itself was finished. The destruction of the Brest fleet meant France lost its ability to contest British naval supremacy for the remainder of the war. The Toulon fleet had been shattered at Lagos in August. The Brest fleet was destroyed at Quiberon Bay in November. France still possessed individual warships and could conduct commerce raiding, but couldn't assemble a fleet capable of challenging British control of strategic waters. This maritime dominance allowed Britain to operate freely in colonial theatres without fear of French naval interference. British expeditions seized French Caribbean islands, Guadeloupe, Martinique, St. Lucia. In India, French strongholds fell without relief from France. In North America, Quebec's conquest in September became permanent because no French fleet could reverse it. The year 1759 entered British popular memory as the Year of Victories, and Quiberon Bay was celebrated as the climactic triumph. Minden in August had seen British and Allied forces defeat the French in Germany. Lagos in August had destroyed the Mediterranean French fleet. Quebec in September had won Canada. Quiberon Bay in November completed the sequence, ending the invasion threat and breaking French naval power definitively. Britain had won on every front, in every theatre, against every challenge. Bells rang across the country when news of each victory arrived. Bonfires blazed. Songs were written. The national mood was jubilant. Yet even amidst celebration, contemporary observers recognized that Quiberon Bay was unique. Minden had been won through disciplined infantry fighting in conventional battle. Quebec had been audacious, but followed established siege warfare principles until Wolfe's final gamble. Lagos had been fought in open ocean in relatively normal conditions. Quiberon Bay was different. Hawke had pursued into a storm, into shoals, into darkness, breaking every rule of cautious naval warfare. The victory was complete, but the risk had been extraordinary. Some contemporaries praised his brilliance. Others quietly suggested he'd been reckless and lucky. The comparison to other battles of 1759 reveals why Quiberon Bay mattered more strategically than its fame suggests. Quebec captured a city and secured Canada, but the war would have continued with or without Quebec. Minden prevented French domination of Germany, but didn't alter the fundamental strategic balance. Lagos destroyed one French fleet, but the Brest fleet remained threatening. Quiberon Bay ended the invasion threat permanently, destroyed the last major French fleet, and secured British naval supremacy that would last for generations. If one had to choose which 1759 battle was most strategically decisive, Quiberon Bay has the strongest claim. The 7 Years' War continued until the Treaty of Paris in 1763, but after November 1759, the outcome was essentially determined. France couldn't invade Britain, couldn't seriously contest British colonial conquests, and couldn't break the naval blockade strangling French trade. The peace treaty formalized what Quiberon Bay had decided. France lost Canada, lost most Caribbean islands, lost its Indian territories, and accepted British maritime supremacy. The British Empire that would dominate the 19th century was founded on victories won in 1759, and Quiberon Bay was the decisive naval foundation. Hawke's personal triumph brought immediate rewards and longer-term recognition. He was celebrated as a national hero, feted in London, and praised by King George II. His aggressive tactics were vindicated by success, silencing critics who'd questioned his risky close blockade strategy and his pursuit into the bay. In 1766, he was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, the highest position in the Royal Navy's administration. He held that post until 1771, using it to implement reforms that improved naval administration, ship design, and officer training. His innovations in blockade strategy became standard Royal Navy doctrine. In 1776, Hawke was raised to the peerage as Baron Hawke of Towton, formal recognition of his services to the nation. He retired from active involvement in naval affairs, but remained respected as one of Britain's greatest admirals. His later years were quiet and comfortable, marked by the satisfaction of having served his country effectively in its hour of greatest need. He died on October 17, 1781, at age 76, having outlived most contemporaries and having witnessed Britain's emergence as dominant global maritime power, a dominance he'd done more than almost anyone to establish. Yet even during his lifetime, Hawke's fame was beginning to fade from popular consciousness. Naval battles, no matter how decisive, captured public imagination less effectively than land campaigns with their easier-to-visualize maneuvers and more familiar scale. The 7 Years' War itself became less celebrated as new crises and wars demanded attention. The American Revolution, beginning in 1775, diverted British attention to a conflict that would ultimately see some of the empire Hawke had defended break away. By the time of his death in 1781, younger officers who'd studied his methods were implementing them in new wars, but the public was forgetting the man who'd pioneered them. The process of forgetting accelerated after 1805. The Battle of Trafalgar on October 21, 1805, exactly 46 years after Quiberon Bay, became the defining British naval victory in popular imagination. Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed a combined Franco-Spanish fleet, ended Napoleon's invasion threat, and died heroically at the moment of triumph. The parallels to Hawke's achievement are obvious. Both ended invasion threats, both destroyed enemy fleets, both secured British naval supremacy. But Nelson's dramatic death, Napoleon's fame as an enemy more threatening than Louis XV, and the Napoleonic War's place in more recent memory, ensured Trafalgar overshadowed Quiberon Bay completely. Nelson himself had studied Hawke's tactics and openly acknowledged his debt to his predecessor. Nelson's famous tactical doctrine, close with the enemy quickly, break their line, trust subordinate commanders to show initiative, was essentially Hawke's method refined and expanded. Nelson's use of general chase tactics at the Nile in 1798, where British ships attacked in succession without waiting for formation, directly echoed Hawke's order at Quiberon Bay. Even Nelson's aggressive pursuit of the Franco-Spanish fleet to Trafalgar, despite risks, resembled Hawke's pursuit to Quiberon. Nelson succeeded partly because he'd learned from Hawke how aggressive tactics could achieve decisive victory. But the student became more famous than the master. Several factors explain this inversion. Nelson died at Trafalgar, shot by French musket fire at the moment of complete victory. His death created a romantic martyr narrative that gripped the public imagination. Hawke survived all his battles and died quietly in retirement. Death in victory makes heroes immortal. Survival makes them mortal and eventually forgotten. Napoleon as enemy was more personally threatening and dramatically interesting than the faceless French monarchy. The Napoleonic Wars were more recent in British memory when historical accounts were being written and popularized. The Victorian era, when British imperial consciousness reached its height, looked back to Trafalgar as the symbolic moment of British naval mastery, overlooking that Quiberon Bay had established that mastery 2 generations earlier. Geographic and visual factors contributed to Hawke's obscurity. Quiberon Bay was fought in French waters, in a storm, in conditions that made witnessing and recording difficult. No dramatic paintings immortalized the scene as Benjamin West's painting immortalized Wolfe's death, or as numerous artists painted Nelson's death. The bay itself was unfamiliar to British audiences, a foreign shore, difficult to visualize. Trafalgar was fought in clearer weather and the name itself became synonymous with British naval power through constant repetition. Understanding why Hawke won requires examining the intersection of leadership, tactics, fortune, and systemic advantages that combined to produce such a disproportionate victory. The outcome, 6 or 7 French ships destroyed versus 1 British ship lost, suggests either overwhelming British superiority or catastrophic French incompetence. Reality was more nuanced. Hawke won through a combination of aggressive leadership, innovative tactics, calculated risk acceptance, and capitalizing on advantages, whilst the French made critical errors amplified by bad fortune. Hawke's leadership was the decisive factor at every stage. His strategic decision to maintain close blockade throughout autumn, despite weather risks and ship wear, prevented Conflans from escaping earlier when conditions might have been more favorable to French plans. His tactical decision to return to sea immediately on November 14th, rather than waiting for perfect readiness, meant he was positioned to intercept Conflans when the French finally sailed. His operational decision to pursue at maximum speed, rather than cautiously following, meant he caught Conflans before the French could destroy Duff's squadron and consolidate. And his battle decision to follow into Quiberon Bay, despite all the obvious dangers, forced the decisive engagement that destroyed the French fleet. That final decision, all sail after them, was the moment where Hawke's entire career and philosophy culminated. Traditional naval doctrine, embodied in the fighting instructions that governed fleet tactics, emphasized maintaining the line of battle. Ships were to stay in formation, engage opposite numbers in the enemy line, and maneuver as a coordinated whole. This produced orderly battles where admirals controlled events, but rarely achieved decisive results. Hawke's general chase order threw away that control in favor of giving every captain freedom to pursue, engage, and navigate independently. It required enormous trust in subordinate commanders and acceptance that once given such freedom, individual ships might make mistakes or be lost to hazards. The trust was justified. Captains like Lord Howe demonstrated exactly the aggressive competence Hawke had counted on, capturing Heros despite the chaotic conditions. Other captains navigated the shoals successfully, avoided collisions with friendly ships in the melee, and engaged French vessels opportunistically as targets presented themselves. Only Resolution ran firmly aground, and even that wasn't fatal. She was refloated after the battle. The British Officer Corps in 1759 had been shaped by decades of continuous naval warfare, producing a generation of experienced, competent commanders capable of exercising initiative effectively. Hawke's genius was recognizing he commanded such men and unleashing them. The tactical situation favored aggression in ways that weren't immediately obvious. The storm that made entering the bay so dangerous also limited how both fleets could fight. Lower gun decks were unusable with gun ports open in heavy seas. Thésè's capsizing demonstrated that horror. This meant every ship, regardless of size, could only fight with upper-deck guns. A British 74-gun ship could engage a French 80-gun ship almost equally, because both were restricted to roughly half their nominal firepower. The weather that terrified cautious commanders actually reduced French numerical advantages in heavy ships. The geography of Quiberon Bay, deadly as it was, worked against the French more than the British because it prevented the organized defense Conflans might have mounted in open water. French ships, scattered throughout the bay, seeking individual anchorage, couldn't support each other. British ships could pursue isolated targets without facing concentrated French firepower. The shoals that threatened to wreck British ships equally threatened French vessels, and in the end, destroyed more French ships through groundings and wrecks than through British gunfire. British seamanship advantages manifested in ships that were better maintained and crews that were more practiced. Hawke's fleet had been at sea continuously throughout the blockade, their crews drilling in ship handling and gunnery despite the weather. French ships had been in port for months, their crews' skills deteriorating from inactivity. British ships had been kept in fighting condition despite the blockade's wear, because British dockyards could supply and repair them. French ships suffered from France's economic strain, and the difficulty of maintaining fleets while blockaded. These small accumulated advantages meant British ships handled better in the storm, navigated the shoals more successfully, and fought more effectively despite equal or worse conditions. British gunnery was superior in rate of fire, accuracy, and effectiveness. British gun crews trained constantly, drilling in the mechanical sequence of loading, running out, firing, and reloading until the process became automatic. French crews, less consistently trained and with aristocratic officers, sometimes less technically proficient than their British counterparts, couldn't match British fire rates. In a battle lasting only 2 hours before darkness, British ships firing 3 broadsides to every 2 French broadsides achieved 50% more hits despite no better accuracy per shot. Conflans made critical errors that Hawke exploited ruthlessly. The strategic error was attempting to break out when he did, rather than waiting for better conditions or until Hawke's fleet had been forced to disperse by winter weather. The operational error was heading for Quiberon Bay rather than attempting to fight in open water where French numbers might have mattered more. The tactical error was assuming British wouldn't follow into the bay, an assumption that revealed Conflans didn't understand he faced an opponent who rejected orthodox caution. Once British ships were in the bay, Conflans failed to organize any coordinated defense, allowing British ships to engage his fleet piecemeal. French command structure was more rigid than British, with less emphasis on initiative at captain level. French naval doctrine stressed preserving ships as national assets, making French captains less willing to risk their vessels aggressively. French officer corps included many aristocrats appointed for social status rather than professional competence, though this was less true at captain level than for junior officers. French crews included higher proportions of pressed landsmen and soldiers serving as marines, giving them less seamanship expertise than British crews who were predominantly professional sailors. These systemic disadvantages meant French ships individually and collectively couldn't match British performance, even when not obviously outclassed in material terms. Fortune favoured Hawke at critical moments, though his aggressive tactics created opportunities for fortune to favour him. The weather, whilst dangerous, was survivable and limited French advantages. The timing of sunset gave enough light to fight, but darkness to prevent total French annihilation. Had the battle occurred 2 hours earlier, more French ships might have been caught and destroyed. French ships capsized from water through gun ports, which was partly bad luck, but also resulted from French attempts to return fire with lower decks. British ships avoided this fate, partly through better damage control, and partly through fortune. Resolution grounded but wasn't destroyed, a lucky outcome that could easily have gone worse. The comparison between Quiberon Bay and Trafalgar illuminates why Hawke's victory was tactically more remarkable despite Trafalgar's greater fame. Nelson at Trafalgar faced a Franco-Spanish fleet that was demoralized, poorly coordinated, and led by an admiral who didn't want to fight. British advantages in gunnery, seamanship, and morale were overwhelming. The weather was light winds and moderate seas, making ship handling easier. Nelson didn't achieve surprise. The enemy knew he was coming. The victory was comprehensive, but achieved against a second-rate force. Hawke at Quiberon Bay faced a French fleet that was well-equipped, competently led, and not obviously inferior to British ships. He achieved tactical surprise by doing what no sane admiral would do, pursuing into shoals during a gale. He fought in weather that made ship handling desperately difficult and navigation potentially fatal. He won decisively, despite roughly equal starting forces and while operating in enemy home waters. Trafalgar was brilliant execution of sound tactics against an inferior enemy. Quiberon Bay was inspired gambling that succeeded through a combination of skill, aggression, and acceptable risk acceptance. The calculation Hawke made can be reconstructed. Pursuing into the bay risked losing ships to groundings, collisions, and the storm itself. Not pursuing meant Conflans escaped to fight another day. The invasion threat remained alive, and the entire year's blockade had been wasted. Hawke judged that his officers were competent enough to navigate the dangers, that British seamanship was superior enough to make the risks acceptable, and that catching Conflans was worth risking his fleet. He was right, but if Resolution had been followed by 3 or 4 more British ships grounding, if the storm had wrecked multiple British ships overnight, if Conflans had organised an effective defence, any of these could have turned Hawke's boldness into disaster. Edward Hawke returned to Britain as a conquering hero, celebrated in the same jubilant national mood that had greeted news of victories at Minden, Lagos, and Quebec. The London Gazette published detailed accounts of the battle. Newspapers printed breathless descriptions of the chase into the bay, the storm, the sinking of French ships, and the complete destruction of the invasion fleet. Poets composed verses celebrating Hawke's courage and Britain's naval supremacy. Commemorative medals were struck. His portrait was painted and engraved for popular distribution. For a brief, glorious period in late 1759 and early 1760, Hawke was one of the most famous men in Britain, the admiral who'd saved the nation from invasion through audacious brilliance. The immediate strategic results were obvious and transformative. The French invasion army dispersed, its soldiers sent to other theatres or garrison duties. The flat-bottomed invasion barges were abandoned, eventually rotting in their harbours, or broken up for timber. France's ability to threaten Britain directly was finished. The psychological impact was equally important. British morale soared, whilst French strategic planning had to accept that naval operations against Britain were futile. French naval strategy shifted to commerce raiding with individual frigates and privateers rather than fleet actions, acknowledging they couldn't contest British control of strategic waters. His appointment as First Lord of the Admiralty in 1766 gave him administrative authority to shape the Royal Navy institutionally. He reformed the dockyards, improving efficiency and reducing corruption that had plagued naval administration. He advocated for better ship designs, particularly improvements to copper bottoming that reduced marine growth on hulls and increased ship speed. He supported reforms to officer training, though the Naval Academy system wouldn't be fully established until decades later. His close blockade strategy became standard Royal Navy doctrine, taught to new officers as the proper method for containing enemy fleets. The aggressive pursuit tactics he'd pioneered were studied and emulated. His elevation to the peerage as Baron Hawke of Towton in 1776 was formal recognition that his services merited hereditary honour. The timing was significant. 1776 was the year American colonists declared independence, beginning a war that would challenge British power. Hawke's ennoblement was partly political calculation by Lord North's government to associate itself with past glories when current circumstances were deteriorating. But it was also genuine recognition that Hawke belonged among Britain's great commanders, whose victories had shaped national destiny. His retirement from active naval affairs in 1771 was quiet and comfortable. He lived on his estates, maintained correspondence with naval colleagues, and watched younger officers implement strategies he'd pioneered. His health remained reasonably good until his final years. He died on October 17, 1781, at age 76, having outlived most contemporaries and having witnessed both the triumph of 1759 and the humiliation of losing the American colonies. His funeral was respectful, but not grandiose. He was buried at the family estate rather than in Westminster Abbey, where naval heroes were sometimes interred. His passing was noted in newspapers, but didn't generate the national outpouring of grief that would accompany Nelson's death 24 years later. The process of forgetting Hawke began almost immediately and accelerated through the 19th century. Several factors contributed to his slide from celebrated hero to historical footnote. The first and most obvious was Nelson. When Nelson died at Trafalgar in 1805, he became the definitive British naval hero. His aggressive tactics, his famous signals, his romantic relationship with Emma Hamilton, and his death at the moment of complete victory created a narrative that captured British imagination totally. Subsequent historians, biographers, and popular writers focused on Nelson obsessively, treating him as the greatest naval commander in British history, and either ignoring or minimizing predecessors who'd achieved comparable victories. Nelson himself had studied Hawke's methods and acknowledged his debt to earlier admirals who'd pioneered aggressive tactics. But the public wasn't interested in complicated questions of tactical lineage. They wanted heroes, and Nelson provided a more compelling heroic narrative than Hawke. Nelson died dramatically, shot on Victory's quarterdeck while signals reading, "England expects that every man will do his duty," flew from his masts. Hawke lived into mundane old age after giving the order, "All sail after them," in a storm. Death in victory creates immortal heroes. Survival creates retired administrators who fade from memory. The Napoleonic Wars' place in more recent memory, when Victorian historians wrote their definitive accounts, meant Trafalgar received vastly more attention than Quiberon Bay. The generation writing popular histories in the 1840s-1870s had grown up hearing stories from Napoleonic War veterans. That war felt immediate and relevant. The 7 Years' War was their grandparents' generation, 2 wars back, less viscerally real. Victorian Britain at the height of empire looked back to Trafalgar as the symbolic moment British naval supremacy was confirmed, ignoring that Quiberon Bay had established that supremacy 50 years earlier. Geographic and visual factors contributed significantly to Hawke's obscurity. Quiberon Bay was fought in French waters, in a storm, in conditions that made dramatic visual representation difficult. No artist produced a painting of Hawke at Quiberon Bay that could rival Benjamin West's iconic Death of Wolfe or the numerous paintings of Nelson's death. Trafalgar was fought in clearer weather, and Turner's famous painting, The Fighting Temeraire, captured popular imagination, even though it depicted aftermath rather than battle. The visual culture of Victorian Britain reinforced Trafalgar's fame, whilst Quiberon Bay lacked compelling images. The location itself worked against Hawke. Quiberon Bay was a French coastal location unfamiliar to British audiences, difficult to visualize, with no resonant associations. Trafalgar was fought off Cape Trafalgar on the Spanish coast, but the name became synonymous with British power through Trafalgar Square in London, Nelson's column, and constant cultural reinforcement. When you walked through central London, you encountered Trafalgar commemorations constantly. Quiberon Bay had no equivalent cultural presence. The nature of Hawke's achievement was also harder to explain to popular audiences than Nelson's. Trafalgar was a straightforward fleet action where British ships destroyed or captured Franco-Spanish vessels in methodical combat. The tactics were innovative, but comprehensible. Quiberon Bay required understanding why entering the bay was so dangerous, why the weather made it worse, why darkness approaching created time pressure, and why Hawke's decision was so bold. The complexity made it harder to reduce to simple heroic narrative that popular histories preferred. Hawke's personality was also less suited to myth-making than Nelson's. Nelson was flamboyant, theatrical, prone to dramatic gestures and quotable statements. His relationship with Emma Hamilton was scandalous and romantic. His vanity about decorations and honors made him a vivid character. Hawke was more reserved, professional, focused on professional competence rather than personal glory. He was an excellent commander, but not a theatrical personality. Victorian audiences preferred heroes who were larger than life, and Hawke's sober professionalism couldn't compete with Nelson's dramatic flair. The Victorian emphasis on the Napoleonic period as Britain's defining struggle also meant the 7 Years' War was treated as a prelude rather than a climactic achievement in its own right. Historians framed the entire 18th century as preparation for the Napoleonic challenge, making battles like Quiberon Bay seem like preliminary victories rather than decisive achievements. The reality that British imperial supremacy was established by 7 Years' War victories was obscured by the narrative that everything culminated in defeating Napoleon. Modern military historians have partially rehabilitated Hawke's reputation. Professional analyses of naval warfare recognize Quiberon Bay as tactically more innovative than Trafalgar and strategically at least equally important. Academic histories of the Royal Navy give Hawke significant attention. But academic recognition hasn't translated to popular knowledge. Ask educated British people to name their country's greatest admirals, and they'll say Nelson, perhaps Drake, maybe Blake. Hawke despite achieving a victory as important as Trafalgar, remains known primarily to specialists. The comparison between Hawke and Nelson reveals uncomfortable truths about how history is remembered and heroes are created. Military achievement alone doesn't guarantee lasting fame. Timing, depth, personality, visual representation, cultural reinforcement, and narrative simplicity all matter enormously. Hawke achieved everything Nelson achieved: ended invasion threat, destroyed enemy fleet, pioneered aggressive tactics, inspired subordinates, but lived instead of dying, fought in storms instead of calm weather, and had the misfortune of preceding rather than following in historical memory. On November 20th, 1759, Edward Hawke stood on the quarterdeck of HMS Royal George and made a decision that saved Britain, ended an invasion threat, destroyed an enemy fleet, and changed the course of world history. He chose to pursue 21 French ships into storm-lashed Quiberon Bay in a gale with darkness approaching, breaking every rule of cautious naval warfare. Within 3 hours, 6 French ships were destroyed. France's last fleet capable of contesting British naval supremacy was shattered, and the invasion that might have ended Britain's imperial ambitions before they truly began was permanently cancelled. It was one of the most decisive naval victories in history, achieved through leadership so aggressive that even describing it makes it sound reckless rather than brilliant. The human cost of that victory demands acknowledgement before celebrating strategic success. French casualties approached 2,500 men, most of them drowned when ships capsized or wrecked. Taizé went down with 630 men trapped below decks or swept away in the freezing Atlantic. Superbe took 630 more to the bottom when she capsized on Le Fort Shoal. Juste wrecked during the night with 700 aboard. Soleil Royal was burned by the French themselves rather than captured, but her crew survived. British losses were concentrated primarily in HMS Essex, wrecked overnight with approximately 400 crew drowned. Perhaps 200 more British sailors were killed or wounded in the afternoon's combat. Over 3,000 men died in total, drowned, crushed, burned or shot, so that strategic objectives could be achieved and empires could rise or fall. The immediate aftermath saw Hawke celebrated as a national hero, and rightly so. He'd saved Britain from invasion through bold action when cautious commanders would have waited outside the bay and allowed the French fleet to escape. His aggressive tactics had been vindicated by complete success. His trust in subordinate commanders had been justified by their competent performance. His calculation that the risks were acceptable, given the stakes, had proven correct. Britain's government rewarded him, the public celebrated him, and his professional reputation was secured. But Hawke's later career, comfortable and honoured though it was, didn't include the dramatic martyrdom that creates immortal heroes. He served as First Lord of the Admiralty, implementing administrative reforms and shaping Royal Navy doctrine. He was raised to the peerage as Baron Hawke. He retired in 1771 and lived another decade in peaceful obscurity. He died in 1781 at age 76, having witnessed Britain lose the American colonies despite the naval supremacy he'd helped establish. His funeral was respectful, but quiet. No national outpouring of grief accompanied his passing. He was buried at his estate rather than Westminster Abbey. Within a generation, his name was fading from popular consciousness. The reasons for Hawke's forgetting are multiple and interconnected, but they reveal fundamental truths about how history is remembered. Nelson's death at Trafalgar in 1805 created the definitive British naval hero narrative. Aggressive tactics producing complete victory, famous signals about duty, dramatic death at the moment of triumph. Nelson became the standard against which all other naval commanders were measured, and his fame was so overwhelming that it consumed oxygen that might have sustained memory of predecessors who'd achieved comparable victories. The fact that Nelson had studied Hawke's tactics and explicitly built upon them was forgotten, as Nelson became the originator rather than the inheritor of aggressive naval doctrine. The Napoleonic War's chronological proximity to the Victorian period, when popular histories were written, meant Trafalgar received vastly more attention than Quiberon Bay. Victorian historians writing in the 1840s, 1870s treated the Napoleonic Wars as recent, relevant history, whilst the 7 Years' War was relegated to a more distant past. The empire Victoria ruled was explicitly seen as having been secured by defeating Napoleon, not by defeating Louis XIV. Trafalgar became the symbolic moment of British naval supremacy, and Quiberon Bay, which had actually established that supremacy 50 years earlier, was forgotten. Death versus survival mattered enormously in creating lasting fame. Nelson died heroically, shot on Victory's quarterdeck at age 47, whilst Britain's greatest naval victory unfolded around him. His death was dramatic, untimely, and occurred at the precise moment of complete triumph. This created the perfect tragic hero narrative that culture celebrates and remembers. Hawke survived all his battles and died in bed at 76 after a decade of retirement. Survival meant no dramatic death scene to memorialize, no sense of sacrifice, no tragic dimension to his story. Heroes who live into comfortable old age are forgotten. Heroes who die in victory become immortal. Visual representation contributed significantly to memory. Benjamin West's painting of Wolfe dying at Quebec became iconic, reproduced endlessly, embedding that scene in British cultural consciousness. Multiple artists painted Nelson's death with similar effect. No comparable painting of Hawke at Quiberon Bay existed. The battle's conditions, storm, spray, darkness, made dramatic visual representation difficult. Turner's Fighting Temeraire and other naval paintings reinforced Trafalgar's fame. Quiberon Bay had no visual cultural presence to sustain popular memory. Geography reinforced these patterns. Trafalgar Square in central London, Nelson's column, the constant cultural references to Trafalgar meant Victorian Britons encountered that battle's memory regularly. Quiberon Bay was a French coastal location without British cultural associations. Walking through London, you saw Trafalgar commemorated everywhere. You never encountered Quiberon Bay memorials. Cultural memory requires constant reinforcement, and Hawke lacked the institutional and geographic anchors that sustained Nelson's fame. Personality and narrative simplicity also mattered. Nelson was theatrical, quotable, romantically entangled with Emma Hamilton, vain about honours, dramatic in gesture. His personality made good stories. Hawke was reserved, professional, focused on competence rather than glory. Victorian audiences preferred heroes who were vivid characters, and Hawke's sober professionalism couldn't compete narratively with Nelson's flamboyance. Additionally, explaining Trafalgar's significance was straightforward. British fleet destroyed Franco-Spanish fleet, ending invasion threat. Explaining Quiberon Bay required understanding why entering the bay was so dangerous, why the weather mattered, why darkness created time pressure. Complexity works against popular memory. Modern military historians recognize Hawke's achievement and rank Quiberon Bay alongside Trafalgar in strategic importance. Professional analyses acknowledge that Hawke pioneered the aggressive tactics Nelson later perfected and that his victory was tactically more remarkable given the conditions. Academic naval histories give Hawke substantial attention, but academic recognition hasn't translated to popular knowledge. Outside specialist circles, Hawke remains virtually unknown, whilst Nelson's fame is universal. The comparison reveals uncomfortable truths about historical memory. Military achievement alone doesn't guarantee lasting fame. Timing matters. Coming second means being forgotten, even if your achievement equals or exceeds the more famous successor. Death matters. Dying heroically creates lasting fame, whilst survival leads to obscurity. Personality matters. Theatrical characters are remembered whilst reserved professionals are forgotten. Visual culture matters. Famous paintings sustain memory, whilst lack of visual representation allows forgetting. Cultural reinforcement matters. Commemorative squares and columns maintain fame, whilst absence of physical memorials allows obscurity. Hawke's story is ultimately about justice and historical understanding. He deserves recognition alongside Nelson as one of Britain's greatest admirals. Quiberon Bay deserves acknowledgement alongside Trafalgar as one of the decisive naval battles that established British supremacy. The wonderful year of 1759 deserves as much attention as the Napoleonic Wars that followed it. The 7 Years' War victories that founded the British Empire deserve recognition equal to the Napoleonic victories that preserved it. The lessons Hawke's career teaches remain relevant. Leadership requires calculated risk-taking, not paralyzing caution. Decisive victory requires accepting danger rather than prioritizing safety above all. Trust in capable subordinates enables success that micromanagement prevents. Innovation that breaks orthodox rules can achieve results, orthodox methods cannot. Experience and professional competence matter more than social rank or political connections. And sometimes the boldest decision, the one that seems to court disaster, is actually the wisest choice given the circumstances. On November 20, 1759, Edward Hawke gave the order, "All sail after them," and pursued an enemy fleet into a storm, into shoals, into darkness, into conditions that should have been suicide. He won decisively through aggressive brilliance that violated every principle of cautious naval warfare. He saved Britain from invasion, destroyed French naval power, and secured the maritime supremacy that would define the next century. And history forgot him because he had the misfortune to survive his greatest triumph rather than dying dramatically, to fight in storms rather than calm seas, and to precede Nelson rather than following him. But now you know the truth. You know that before Nelson's "England expects," there was Hawke's "All sail after them." You know that before Trafalgar ended Napoleon's invasion threat, Quiberon Bay ended Louis XV's invasion threat. You know that the aggressive tactics celebrated at Trafalgar were pioneered at Quiberon Bay. And you know that the admiral history forgot was every bit as important as the admiral history immortalized. Edward Hawke saved Britain on November 20, 1759, and he deserves to be remembered.